An abstract truth, a revolutionary document for all men, for all time. These are Abraham Lincoln's thoughts on the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, we hold these self-evident truths that all men are created equal and we have the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the just form of rule is the consent of the governed. Yada, yada, yada. We hear this all the time. We're taught this in grade school, but sometimes we may take this for granted. Noah Webster, who was one of America's founding fathers, said that it is essential for all Americans, especially if you're living here, to know your role as a citizen and understand these principles. Millions of our revolutionary heroes, our veterans, our activists, both men and women, have fought hard for our country to be closer to these principles. So that's why it's essential for us to really have a deep understanding of what they are and what they mean for ourselves and for our community. The just form of rule is the consent of the governed. What does this mean? Imagine if all of us were in a deserted island somewhere and there was no rule of law. That means we take the law in our own hands. So this means that man by nature has no natural ruler. Throughout the history of the world, there was a divine right of kings. This said that God has chosen me to be king, and you are all my subjects. But the Declaration says no, the just form of rule is consent of the governed. This means that man has no natural ruler. Bees have a natural ruler, which is the queen bee, but men don't. So the only just form of rule is when we elect or consent that this person should rule over us. That is the only just form of rule. So when in a deserted island, when we're all in the state of nature, we take laws into our own hands. And once we take laws to our own hands, the problem with this, living in the society, as Thomas Hobbes says, is that it's short, nasty, and brutish. Meaning that if someone were to steal from me, then I get to choose how I'm going to punish that individual. So obviously this society is not manageable. So we all band together and elect who should rule over us. And in return, the ruler, his only job is to protect and safeguard our rights and liberties. So that's the only just form of rule, the consent of the governed. And now if you look at American history, it's very unprecedented. It's the only nation that has elected their government based on reflection and choice. So when the founders or representatives of the state went to go draft the Constitution, they didn't just impose this form of government to the people. They thought it through. Are we going to have 3 branches? Or should we have a monarch? Should we have a president? Originally, the people really adored George Washington and they wanted him to be a monarch. But the representatives and the statesmen of the states did not think this was possible because we said we just abolished our bans from the monarch. Therefore, it's not practical. But maybe George Washington may be a good president, but we can't guarantee that other monarchs that are succeeding George Washington will be a good president and preserve and protect our rights. And what's also revolutionary about this time period of the founding was that the majority of the states, so when they drafted the Constitution, they did not impose it on the citizens of the colonies. They had time to choose and elect and deliberate whether this should be our form of rule. Like I said before, throughout the history of the world, empires conquered other territories and other peoples, and the people themselves didn't have a choice of who's going to rule over them. So now, for the first time, America had a choice of what government is going to rule over us. That's why we elect our leaders. It comes from that basic principle. In America, the individual is the king. There is no divine rule of law, divine right of kings. The individual is the king. And we all band together and elect that leader. So this is great. We applied this principle of the Declaration, the just form of rule is consent of the governed, but America had one major sin still left. One major sin. It was the sin of slavery. How could we have this beautiful principle that said all men are created equal, but yet we're contradicting our principles by enslaving another group of people? Now, it was the hope of the founders that over time the country would adopt this principle into their own souls, and everyone would adopt it, and slavery will be ridden over time. But that was not the case, unfortunately. However, many of the founders were dead set against slavery, and even Thomas Jefferson himself said that America will pay for the sin of slavery. And we were headed we took steps to head to the right direction. For example, in 1808, one of the organic laws of the United States is the Northwest Ordinance. So this was created right after the Constitution. And the Northwest Ordinance states that any new states admitted in the Northwest Territories, slavery shall be prohibited in those states. And in 1808, Congress prohibited the importation of slaves. Because there are many historians and academics out there that says, oh, the word men in the Declaration, that just means white men. And these slave-holding founding fathers just wanted to create a country for white men only. But that's not true. If you look at the word men, that was the word men, and take a dictionary that was used at the time, and look at what that word men meant, it's just a generic masculine pronoun that meant human being. And like I said before, these laws, for example, the importation of slavery, the Northwest Ordinance, you can clearly see evidence that men did not only refer to white men, it referred to all human beings. Now, that's great. So we took steps in the right direction, but unfortunately the founders hoped that natural circumstances will get rid of this evil institution. Was not true. Lincoln, that's where he came along. And Lincoln in his House Divided speech said that a house divided does not stand. If we accept, if America or if the southern states decide to contradict its own principles of all men are created equal, we have to go to war. We have to go to war. America's sacred principles are being compromised. So that's why we went to war. And from this period, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment got rid of slavery. The 14th Amendment gave people of color equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment gave people of color voting rights. So we made tremendous gains in preserving those principles. And then the succession comes with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I know he's just the figurehead of the movement. There's many more men and women that sacrificed and made gains, just like during the Civil War. But if you were to take a look at Dr. King's movement, he helped start the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, and helped make that come into law. And what these laws embodied was our fundamental principles. It took us a return to our principles. In his I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King said, "Don't judge me by the color of my skin, but by the content of my character." Now, I know that this principle is the most quoted statement of Dr. King, but when you really examine what this meant, is that my skin color doesn't matter. Why? Because all men are created equal. So, after analyzing history, and I was a student of political science myself, so after analyzing the history, I'm sort of wrapped with all these ideas, and I was trying to piece this all together. Then 3 years ago, I went to Washington, D.C. I was working there, and I visited the Lincoln Memorial for the first time. So I go up to the statue of Lincoln. I'm like, wow, it's just this great statue. And right below me, it said, "I have a dream, MLK." So I was standing on the footsteps where Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. I just had to take that in. It was an incredible moment, and I'm like, wow, he just changed the world right here from this platform. I was standing right where he was standing. And so things were coming together for me. I said, oh, wow. These guys, Lincoln, men, our revolutionary heroes, our veterans, they didn't create the country in their own image, meaning that they didn't use their power to construct a whole new society. You know what they did? Dr. King carried the torch from Lincoln, right? And then Dr. King took that torch and brought it back to our founding principles, that all men are created equal. So it was a progress, but it was a return to our first principles. And that's what just linked up the whole connection and all these ideas. That's what this whole, all the country, all the gains that we made were to take us back to those first principles. They did not create the country in their own image. And as you can see today, I'm not saying our society is perfect, but relative to the past, you can see that we're clearly living closer to those principles that all men are created equal. Skin color is not as significant as it was in the past for me to go to a certain school, start my own business. But what happened was that the society was contradicting these principles, so we had to make those laws. The Declaration, we didn't need the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Acts. It acts if we had adopted and applied those principles early on. Those principles, equal protection under the law, your race does not matter when you're voting. I mean, these are just merely affirming the principles of the Declaration. But the reason why we had to fight for these principles to affirm the principles of the Declaration, and that is why Lincoln was so monumental, because he took us back to those principles. Lincoln, King, all these individuals, they moderated their honor because they took us to the principles of the founders. And now, if it wasn't for all these gains that were made by all our heroes, I wouldn't personally be standing here today and give you this speech. My story comes, I live my story through my parents' story. I'm of Afghan descent from Afghanistan, and my parents are originally from Afghanistan. And they were forced to leave their country to come to this country. During the late 70s, the Soviet communists had invaded Afghanistan. And for millions and millions of people, those were some tough times. It was like a war zone time. And my dad's brother was killed. One of my dad's cousin was killed from protesting. Shots were fired because in that form of regime, you don't have free expression. There's no freedom. The state is God in that kind of regime. And I hear stories, and I've interviewed all my family members, and they tell me stories. One of my family members had to go to prison. It was just a very dangerous time, especially if you had negative sentiments towards the government. They'd really interrogate you, put you in prison, and a lot of bad things would happen, tortures and things like that. And I remember my mom telling my story how she got lucky. They were trying to flee the country. It was my mom, and she was a teenager back then. My mom, my aunt, my grandma, they hired somebody to help them flee them out of the country to go to Pakistan. And one of the checkpoint guys, a military guy, stopped them. He was from the Communist Army. Stopped them and interrogated them and took them back for interrogation. And luckily, they escaped that situation because my mom knew a friend that knew the head chief of that department. So just all these things go on, and a lot of people from that part of the world can tell you more stories, and even my dad's story is incredible. He had to hire somebody to escort him out of the country, climb the mountains of Afghanistan to go to Pakistan, and the government, he had a friend in Germany, and he had no family. He had to leave his family behind, go out on his own, and his friend in Germany had written him a letter to come there, but it had to be in code because the government reads your mail. But he knew that, okay, he wants me to come to Germany. He was telling me his escape story. My uncle was a doctor. He was helping, we called them America calls them the freedom fighters, to the individuals who would defeat the Russians, the communists. He was in camp in battle, treating to their wounds, things like that, and it's just incredible. Then my dad was able to come to this country. As an immigrant. He was part of this nonprofit foundation. He already had an architecture background, and he came to South Carolina, Greenville, from nothing. He had no family, nothing. He was by himself, and he had just this little organization. They provided him housing, helped him look for a job, and he just started from scratch. He was able to sponsor all my family, my grandparents, and I have five. On my dad's side, I have 5 aunts, 3 brothers. 1 brother was killed. I have my mom's side. I have 6 aunts, one uncle. So we have large families. That's the culture over there. And we were able to sponsor. My dad at that time, knock on wood, was able to sponsor all my family. And now they all live here, San Diego, from that war zone right there. Now they live in San Diego, LA area, New York, just all in the States, doing very well for themselves. And the opportunities that this country provided, look at that. I mean, they have an accent. They don't know English. Some of them don't know English really well, but they were able to make something of themselves. Because why? All men are created equal, and that stuff does not matter. In this country, that stuff does not matter. It's all from your own effort. And so the reason why I share this story is to show you the gains that all these great men have provided for my family to flourish in this country. That's why I'm showing you. And I know there's many people that have immigrant stories, and I love those stories. But I just want to share with you today, since I'm speaking, where my background is coming from and how these gains are made from the foundation to where I am today. And now they have paved the way for modern society. And I'm a big fan of modern society, right? Like look at these guys. They're people in war, fighting in bunkers, getting shot, people protesting on the streets. To bring us a society now, it's very comfortable in a lot of ways, right? We watch the Super Bowl. We have smartphones. We have Facebook. We have the Super Bowl. So that's the product of hard work, of hard work of these men and women. But I want us all not to take these things for granted. Our prosperity that we see today, don't take that for granted. If we can, after today or whenever we have time, let us read the Declaration of Independence. Let us read the Constitution so we understand who we are as citizens of this country. Since we're living here, this is relevant for all of us. And the Constitution, some of the Supreme Court justices, they don't give the Declaration as the authority it should have. The Constitution merely protects the principles of the Declaration. That's what many of the Supreme Court justices I see lack, that kind of component when they're giving their opinions. The Constitution protects the principles of the Declaration. That's what it is. They go hand in hand. They work in tandem. So as citizens, I definitely encourage us to really understand and read, because James Madison said, like I said, no nation is perfect. But James Madison said that a government run by men is going to be naturally imperfect. If men were angels, we would not need a government. And James Madison also said of that, if some politician comes about that denies your rights or makes a law, like we had segregation and all these laws, right, that deny the rights of man, and if the American people do not check that politician, then Americans don't deserve those rights anyways. So that's why it's fundamental for all of us to get an understanding of what are the natural law principles of the Declaration. Read the writings of the founders. And we always have to go back to these first principles. That's the progress, and that's what I said. I'm linking up how the progress was actually the return to the principles. So if we can, whenever we get a chance, just read it. It's a short document. It takes probably 20 minutes. I mean, I know we may spend 30 minutes on Facebook doing stuff, but if we can just take 30 minutes to just read the Declaration, read the Constitution, have an understanding of what's going on, we'll be better citizens and be more of value to the community. Thank you.
Candace, what was our time going here? Where am I?
You were at 12:25.
Very good.